What we're going to do today is, and keep in mind that today's going to be a little bit different than in terms of the images and how I'm presenting the images. Then it'll be, through the rest of the course. As we get into this, you'll see I'm going to have a lot of images up, and I don't have the identifying information like the artist and the title and the date. And the reason for that is I'm not so interested in that information as the broader ideas and bigger ideas. And what we're going to do today is talk really briefly about what happens before the time frame that we really pick up in this class. So the designation of this class is 1945 to 2000. So it's literally the second half of the 20th century. And one of the ways that the 20th century, in terms of talking about art, tends to get divided is in the middle of the century, and it has to do with World War II. And it's a huge kind of a pivot point in a way in terms of changes, certainly in the world in general, but when we talk about art, there are big changes that happen after the war, because so many things change because of that. So what we're going to do today is in a really condensed form, and hopefully we'll get through everything today, if not, we'll pick up with it on Monday. What happens between 1900 and 1945, because as we'll see, especially for those artists who are coming of age and who are really becoming notable, and they're the abstract expressionists who become notable in the 1940s, and especially in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They lived through the time period of World War II, and for the most part, they're artists who are really young artists and kind of coming into being as artists in the 1930s, and some of them even in the 1920s as well. So it's not like all of a sudden, boom, these people come out of nowhere. They're living through a good, part of the 20th century. So I think it's worthwhile to talk about, what's happening in the early part of the century and how that's going to. So it also too has some visuals because we'll be making references back to this time period. I like this cartoon. I came across this a couple of years ago. This woman introducing David. He's into modern art now. And so you see, this visual description, right, of normal-looking people, although we know they're cartoon people, and then this modernistic person. What would you say about David? What's different about David from the other people that we see depicted?
He needs a plastic surgeon.
Yeah, he needs a plastic surgeon, perhaps.
He's more of a cubist form.
Yeah, he's a cubist form. And when you say cubist form, how would you describe that without using art language necessarily, like a stylistic designation? There's a Picasso-esque quality to that.
The subject tends to be broken up in various shapes and lines, and there's a lot of distortion. Mm-hmm. But in some of the cubist work, it's clearly visible what you're looking at. Mm-hmm. Despite it being broken. Yeah, that's good. I think that's really good. Right, so it's distorted. We could say abstracted. We didn't say flattened, but we could say flattened as well. Cubism has a huge influence on, and it develops really early in the century, and there's a huge influence on artists, through the first half of the century and on into the second half of the century. And when we think about modern art, and it's the difference between modern with a lowercase, M, and modern with a capital M, that tends to define what modern art is about, right? It's about abstraction, distortion. Abstraction could be in an expressionistic way, but it can also be in a more geometric kind of way as well. And we'll look at examples of both of those. But this idea of distortion, or this, especially, and what essentially distortion means in this context, it's where it differs from the norm, or what we think of as the norm. I think in a lot of ways there really is no norm, but we believe, in it. And that really defines what modern art is. And so as we look at some of these artists and styles, we'll think about some of these ideas. And again, I'm going to run kind of roughshod over this time period and run through the first half. One of the first styles that really hits the scene early in the century is Fauvism. And its birth date is often considered, if you think of its birth date, is often considered to be 1905, with the first independent show, or not the first independent show, but a show of independent artists in Paris, including a group of artists who become known as the Fauve artists. All three images that we see here, works that we see here, are by Henri Matisse.
and Matisse is considered to be like the leader of the Fauve group. One of the things about Fauvism that's really characteristic is that the subject matter is traditional, but the way that it's depicted is not, right? So we've got a portrait, an interior scene, looks kind of like a genre scene, another image with figures in a landscape, looks like it's from a Bacchanalian scene, so there's a long history going back to the ancient world. Creating or depicting scenes such as we see here. But what Fauve artists were doing was they were using bright, arbitrary colors, rough application of paint, rough brushstrokes, and so on. So there's we're certainly seeing a kind of distortion here, but it's this intensity of color. And in a lot of ways, Fauvism has its roots back in post-impressionism, which has its roots in impressionism. This idea of creating the kind of impression of the scene rather than an objective, a real looking kind of image as well. So Fauvism is, a huge, development early in the century. We also see, the other thing also to keep in mind too is that all of these styles are in development pretty much at the same time. So Fauvism, German Expressionism, and Cubism, those three especially, they're all beginning to coalesce in the first decade of the 20th century. So certainly the artists are coming out of the 19th into this new time frame. With German Expressionism, you also have distortion, but it's a different kind of distortion, in some ways for some different reasons. The kind of standard, really short definition of German Expressionism is that it's expressionism, or not expressionism, sorry, it's distortion for emotional effect. So the German Expressionists in general are interested in the experience that you have while looking at the work of art, that you're going to respond to it in a really kind of gut way or gut level. Sometimes it's a pleasant experience, and certainly sometimes it's not necessarily. Two of the works that are here by the same artist, this is Emil Nolde's painting, The Dance Around the Golden Calf. This is his woodcut print, relief print here called Prophet. And I think that they're really good examples of this one, probably the stronger trend of German Expressionism is it's still representational. You still have narrative, we talk about it as narrative painting, especially with the dance around the golden calf. It's a biblical theme. So there's a story that's being told. It's a big story that lots of people know. There's a history, a long history of telling these kinds of stories. The image of the prophet is a little bit more ambiguous. It's kind of a character type. But one of the things about the German Expressionists in particular is that they were interested in a way, in one sense, of kind of revivifying some old ideas and some old trends. So, for example, in the early 20th century, relief printing wasn't a huge thing so much, and relief printing was seen as kind of an old-fashioned way of making prints. Through the 19th century, fine art prints tended to be more like in the intaglio process, engravings and etchings. Lithography is a new print technology that comes into being in the 19th, or the late 18th, but it becomes a bigger thing in the 19th century. And so for artists like German Expressionists, they were actually looking back to their own heritage. They were looking back to German artists in the Middle Ages who were making relief prints. But when you look at a German expressionist print, you don't look at it and think, oh, that looks medieval. It looks very different from medieval prints. But it's the material and the methods that they're using, and they're doing something new with it. They're doing something different with it. So they're kind of revivifying this old idea. And then this image that's up here is by Kandinsky, and this one is, and then one of the reasons why I included this one here is because it represents a different trend or a different kind of part of German Expressionism, and that's a push toward total abstraction, or we can think of it as non-representational, artwork. It does not represent something that's in the real world, and Kandinsky's often credited with being the first artist to do that. And definitely the first artist in the 20th century to make art that doesn't represent things in the real world. It's not to say that it doesn't evoke, feelings or emotions, because certainly one of the things he was interested in was how, potentially how painting could be abstract in the way music is abstract. Music, and especially music without lyrics, and the way music can evoke feelings, different kinds of feelings.
he wanted to do, similar kinds of or things with painting or create paintings that could have a similar kind of effect. So even in one, stylistic designation like this, we can still certainly see lots of variety and in individual styles and individual interests depending on which artist that you're looking at. We also see in the first half of the century developing this idea, I like this idea of cool rationalism, right? This idea of being rational. The reason I say cool rationalism is that the idea of being of rationalism is that you're less driven by your emotions, right? So it's very different in this respect, from something like German Expressionism. The artist that we're looking at here created both of these works. It's Mondrian, and he's working in a style called the style in Dutch, or de stijl, that we see here. This first painting by Mondrian, this is from a series of paintings that he does between around 1907 and 1912, 1913, somewhere around there. So it's starting in that first decade, but continuing on. And for somebody like Mondrian, I think when people think of his work and they think of de stijl, they think of this kind of work that's extreme, like non-representational, very geometric. Certainly, basically this field or grid of black and white, with colored squares and primary colors. You can't get more basic than that in painting in terms of kind of reducing things down to basic elements. But Mondrian was actually still looking at the real world and abstracting it in that way. And he did a whole series of paintings of a tree. You can look this up if you're interested in it. Or actually, if you're looking at the big textbook, it's in the early part of the textbook. He does this whole series of paintings across time where what he's working on becomes more abstract, more abstract, more abstract, and so on, to the point that it's no longer recognizable as a tree. So for work, such as we see here, this image at some point, is connected to it. This image here is not representational, but the process of creating it at some point is connected to something in the real world. So Mondrian's looking at things and breaking them down into basic shapes and forms. And so that's what I mean by this kind of cool rationalism. It's still a very logical way of working. And then there's also Cubism as well, right? So Cubism, again, is first developed in that first decade and, continues on, for decades afterwards. The work that we see here basically represents, these are all by Picasso, and they basically represent the transitions of Cubism. Maybe is one way of thinking about it. So the image on the upper left is Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, and it's often considered to be the first Cubist painting, and that dates to around 1907. And one of the things that Picasso is doing here is that when he first begins working on this painting, he's thinking about painting in a traditional kind of 19th century sense. Like he wanted initially to create a painting that was narrative, that was telling the story. The original, actually not the original version of the painting, but his sketches and his notes show his ideas, and they basically show a design for a painting that shows a sailor, it's either a medical student or a medical doctor in a brothel, right? So surrounded by prostitutes. And the idea is that the sailor represented the idea of lust, but lust could lead to a sexually transmitted disease. And keep in mind that syphilis up until antibiotics become available in the 1920s, and really not widely available until after that. That syphilis is a terminal disease. So if you get syphilis, you will die from it. But it can take decades for it to kill you. So the sailor represents lust, the prostitutes in the sailor. There's that connection there. But there's also fear, right? So there's this idea of fear and desire. Those were the themes of this painting. And then the doctor or medical student that's depicted was in there to represent a mitigating factor, right? So if you've got a disease, ideally, a doctor can help you. So his initial idea for that painting is really kind of what we think of as academic style painting, big, grand narrative, morality, play and so on. But what he ends up producing is this work here, which totally breaks from that tradition. He eliminates the figure of the sailor, he eliminates the doctor. In his original sketches, you see the doctor walking into the room, like pulling a curtain open and then walking into the space. This female here, this figure here, one of the prostitutes, kind of replaces that figure. But what does he do to the figures? What's really notable about the Demoiselle d'Avignon, the way he shows us the figures and the space too?
The faces.
Yeah, what about the faces?
Distorted and
Flat.
They're
Yeah.
mask-like.
Flattened.
They're mask-like.
Mask-like. And mask-like's really important, especially the two on this side, more so than the ones. I think you could say they're all mask-like, but these even more so. The other thing that Picasso's doing in this time period is he's visiting the Trocadero, which was rather an ethnographic, what we would think of today as an ethnographic museum. And the Trocadero had a huge collection of, let me spell this. Can't spell and talk at the same time. That was there we go. Trocadero. The Trocadero in Paris had a huge collection of African and Oceanic works of art and objects from those cultures, and Picasso was looking at African masks in particular, and becoming really intrigued by how different they looked from objects in the Western tradition, and also projecting some of his own ideas on them as to what they mean. And you begin to see these very mask-like forms come into his work. One of the things about African masks, especially the ones that he was looking at that come from West Africa, is that they simplify forms. They're very planar in nature: eyes, ears, nose, mouth. Those forms are what we think of as really reductive, right? They're kind of cooked down or reduced down to these basic shapes and forms, and he brings that into work such as this. So we're seeing work that's, and it's flattened in a kind of geometric way. So space seems less deep, right? So it's shallower and forms are abstracted. So this is really the beginning of Cubism. Then it really fully develops as you go into the next decade of the 20th century. And this is the kind of the Cubist style that's referred to as analytical Cubism, where the artist is analyzing, what he or she is looking at, and creating an image which is basically still representational. So the title of this one here is called Ma Jolie, or My Pretty. It's a portrait of one of Picasso's girlfriends at the time, but I don't think that you'd recognize that, certainly, right away. And if you look carefully, you'll see that it represents a figure, but it's a figure. You'll begin to see forms that you begin to see, like, part of, pieces of a face or head or body shape or, hands, fingers, are probably the easiest things to see there. But what's happening here is Picasso and other artists like Georges Braque and certainly lots of other artists, we get very excited about Cubism in this time period, is that they're thinking about the fact that, we live in a three-dimensional world. We might live in a 4 or 5-dimensional world, actually. If you're a physicist, you might think that, but that makes my head hurt. Most of us are comfortable in the idea of a 3-dimensional world. We live in a 3-dimensional world. We walk through space. Things exist in 3 dimensions. Art, traditionally, especially since the Renaissance forward, has put a lot of emphasis on trying to, in a 2-dimensional surface, right, in a 2-dimensional plane, try to create the illusion of 3 dimensions, right? So try to make things look like they have a front and a back and a side, and light hits them from one side, and there's highlights and shadows and so on. And what happens with Cubist work like this is that the artists are still looking, excuse me, at 3-dimensional objects, and they're looking at them from multiple sides and multiple angles, but they're breaking up the form, flattening it, and putting it into 2 dimensions. So it's still representational work, but it's looking at 3 dimensions and converting it or filtering it, maybe is one way of thinking about it, and putting it into a 2-dimensional form. And that's what we see here. And that's one of the reasons why it's referred to as analytical Cubism, because the artist is analyzing all of this information, rearranging it, and putting it into this form. And then the kind of third variation, of kind of classic Cubism is synthetic Cubism, and that's what we see represented here. And so the difference between synthetic cubism and analytical cubism, and one develops pretty quickly after the other, is that it's not pure painting. It's what we would think of today as mixed media and collage. So we have a category for that. And the reason we have a category for that is because people like Picasso and Georges Braque especially are creating work like this early in the century. So to us, we're pretty comfortable with this idea of looking at something and thinking about what it could be, right? So looking at a piece of paper, of sheet music here, and imagining that it could be, part of a guitar, or a round white circle can be the sound hole, or a little piece of paper that looks like it's, faux wood grain, or looks like it is wood grain, so faux wood, piece of paper could be cut and shaped to look like, the other side of the guitar itself. That's a really new idea, or it's a brand new idea, really in this time period. So we've got with a work like this, there's some, wallpaper. Kind of like we think of it as like gift wrapping type paper. There is also drawing. So here's a sketch, kind of really kind of analytical cubist sketch. But then there's also a newspaper with sheet music certainly, and then there's also a piece of a newspaper here. And it should say Le Journal if we saw the whole heading, but Picasso notably has cut it here to where it says the jour, right? And that word jour is connected to the word, jour, journal, jour meaning day, journal, the newspaper, daily newspaper in particular. But the word jour sounds like the word for game, or to play. And then also notably, he's trimmed it here where the reference was to, some kind of battle going on somewhere in the world. And it says, the battle has begun. The battle is engaged. So he's bringing in this notion of conflict, right? A battle is a kind of conflict, but he's also has this word play in there. So he's playing with tradition. He's playing with the way things normally have been. And in some ways it is a battle. One of the things about modern artists, and this is characteristic of modern art, is that modern artists always want to push ahead, right? There's this term that's really important to know. We'll talk about it in the second half of the century and a shift away from this idea as well. Is this idea of avant-garde. And the word avant-garde is a military term, so this idea of battle kind of comes into play. Avant-garde is what we would think of as a scout, or somebody who does reconnaissance, right? And the term, so originally it's coined to talk about, to be used in a military sense, but it becomes applied to modern artists and so you could say somebody's a modern artist, or you could say they're an avant-garde artist, or you could say, modern art is avant-garde, in this respect. And what that means is that modern artists, especially early in the 20th century, are pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable, pushing the boundaries of, what is, certainly more traditional in terms of artistic production. And that becomes a defining aspect of what modern art is. And I'm kind of really emphasizing this because that's something that changes distinctly in the second half of the century. We'll see that idea continuing, certainly into the 40s and 50s, but especially as we get into the 60s, that's going to begin certainly begin to shift. And in a lot of ways, it's that shift from modern to post-modern. So this modernist idea is really embraces this idea of the avant-garde, that modern artists do new things. They're always chasing the new. They're always trying to find a new mode, a new method of expression. They're trying to be different, in a sense, from everybody else. And then there's all the Cubist variations, right? So there's so many artists who are inspired by Cubism, but they begin to kind of put their own stamp on it. They really kind of take these ideas about Cubism and kind of move it and push it in different directions. So both of these works are by Delaunay, and he's an artist who's talked about as an Orphic artist, or the style is referred to as Orphism. One of the things about Orphism is it brings color back to Cubism, it brings color back into this work. For Picasso and Braque, as they're working side by side, one of the things they talked about, especially with the analytical Cubism, is that it was really difficult to work in color. They were so focused on form that they worked monochromatically and decided not to worry so much about color. Other artists like Delaunay was really interested in color and the expressive and kind of even spiritually expressive possibilities of color. So he begins, other Orphic artists begin creating very cubistic-looking paintings, but color is equally important. It's almost they almost in a way have fauve color, but cubistic form. Other styles that are also, beholden to Cubism in a lot of ways are things like Futurism. This idea of the way forms are fragmented and taken apart, kind of compressed back together. You see it maybe more in Cubist painting, certainly some Cubist sculptures. Both of these are by Boccioni. One of the key ideas embedded within Futurism is this idea of dynamism. And you see this word dynamic or dynamism that's in a lot of the titles of work, dynamic forms, dynamic, whatever. And one of the key ideas about Futurism is that dynamism is one of the things that defines our time period, not our time period, it's true for our time period too, but defines, the early 20th century, defines the modern world itself, right? So if you think about the 19th century, and especially as you're coming into the 20th century, everything is speeding up. The world is, becoming faster. We've got all these new technology, planes, trains, automobiles, and so on. Things like trains are really developed in the 19th century and being used in the 19th century, but bigger trains, faster trains that can carry, more weight or more people are developing. Automobiles are increasingly becoming common, airplanes and so on. In our time, the things that, certainly things speed up like, cars and airplanes and so on, but there's generally, limits on those, at least in, general, kind of public use. In our world, what speeds up regularly? What's that? Technology, right? So technology, the internet, the speed of communication. So speed, and this idea of speed and the rapidity of change is something that happens in our own time, but it's a little different, than the dynamics. It certainly affects us, too, but it's a little bit different than this, this time frame here that we're looking at. There are also things like Cubo-Futurism, right? So there's combining styles. Both of these works here are by Duchamp. Paintings by Duchamp, who's also known as a Dada artist, but begins his career as a painter. His really early work actually looks like Impressionist paintings. They're nice, pleasant scenes, and then he moves in some different directions. The idea of Cubo-Futurism is that you're taking basically a cubist forms, this kind of fractured forms, these kind of geometric shapes, but you're trying to give a sense of the dynamism of those spaces or those objects that are depicting. So, with an artist like this, he's seeing cubist trends happening, he's seeing futurist trends happening, and he's creating kind of a synthesis of both of those things. There's also, and I put this in quotation marks, and this is where we'll finish today, we'll pick up on Monday. But there are also these other little kind of sub-variants. This is a painting by Fernand Léger, and he's sometimes referred to as a tubist artist. Technically, he's kind of cubo-futurist, right? He's got these geometricized, abstracted forms, lots of energy, the appearance of energy in those forms. But characteristically, he paints in these cylinders, or these cylindrical type forms, these tube-like forms. And so, again, in quotation marks, it's not an official designation, but it has this tubistic quality. So this gets us kind of through a good portion of the first half of the century. And when we come back on Monday, we'll pick up here, because one of the things that deeply impacts everything, and certainly artists, in this time period is World War I.